Hello, Year 8. Welcome to the fourth lesson in our distance learning unit on pioneers, inventors, and developers. Last week we learned about Columbus and his voyage from the Old World, Europe, to the New World, the Americas. This week we're going to learn about how the arrival of the conquistadors, so they were Spanish largely, but also Portuguese, explorers, sailor soldiers, affected the people of South America. And we'll be thinking about the positive and negative effects that they had on the people of the Americas. I think it's quite easy to think about the negatives, so all of you should be able to do that. You might even have some ideas from last lesson. Therefore, I'd expect all of you, certainly most of you, to be able to explain the positive and the negative effects as well. We're going to be using historical sources today. So when you come to your overall evaluation about thinking about the impact of this, I'd also like some of you to think about the origin of the sources. Who's saying this? Do you think it's actually trustworthy information? Keywords for today's lesson on the left to describe the conquistadors. We've got King Ferdinand II. So if you see a reference to the king, it'll be him, or it'll be Charles V that replaced him. But basically, we're talking about the Spanish. Conquistadors are these Spanish, but also Portuguese sailor soldiers. So they set out to not only discover new territories, but to conquer it and to settle them as well. A colonist was someone very similar to a conquistador once they'd arrived in this new world, who was then going to take over and control that land. You would set up a colony. And the Spanish is any reference to any of the above, quite simply. You might also see them referred to as Castilian or Castile, which was the house of the royal family at that time. But very simply, they are the Spanish. Okay, keywords to describe the people of South America. If you see the word native, that means a local person. You might also see them in this lesson referred to as Indians, because remember, Columbus had been trying to sail to India, which is why they called the native people here Indians. But quite clearly, this was not in India as we think of it today. Tribes, group of people living in a closed society with their own culture and ancestry, which is what a lot of the native people were in South America at the time, although they did obviously have fantastic civilizations as well. A chief is the leader of a tribe. And these are the three key civilizations who the conquistadors were coming up against: the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans. Okay. So how can we learn about the impact of the Spanish conquistadors on the native people of the South Americas? It's our big learning question. Well, in history, we're going to use sources and we're going to look for evidence. So here are the key sources for this lesson and the next lesson. You'll be looking at this document. It's a letter from Hernan Cortes, who was a Spanish conquistador, and he was writing to his king. You'll be looking at a letter from Christopher Columbus, writing back to a close friend and someone who'd actually given him money, as well as convincing the king when he wanted to do his first voyage, trying to find India, but he actually found the Americas. Source C comes from Bernal Diaz, who wrote a book describing the conquest of what was called New Spain, because they were creating this much larger empire. This source D, comes from a very famous historian who was writing in the 1950s and 1960s about the impact of the Spanish conquistadors on Mexico in particular. Source E is called El Requerimiento. It's called the Requirement. It was a document published by the Spanish monarchy in 1513, and it was basically saying that all of these new territories in the New World, they were required to subject themselves to Spanish rule. Source F, this comes from a medical expert. It's quite an interesting one. He's called Geoffrey Cowley. He was writing in the 1990s, and he's talking about the medical impact or the health impact that the conquistadors and the Spanish had on the native people of South America. Okay, we've got another one from Bernal Diaz in source G. So again, another Spanish writer, this time discussing how Hernan Cortes had conquered the Aztecs. Source H is from a general history book. It's called A World History. You can see it's a set of encyclopedias, and this comes from a specific section called Indians in Latin America. And lastly, source I. If you were to go to Cuba today, you would find a statue of this man in many places. He was called Chief Hatui, and the story goes that before he was executed by the Spanish, he made a speech, and his speech was written down by a Spanish person at the time, a Spanish conquistador, who has then captured his final words and gives us an opinion about the Spanish from one of the native people of South America. In this case, he was actually from Hispaniola, and then fled to modern-day Cuba. So what do you need to do in this particular lesson? Okay, well, there's a little video to watch first that will introduce you to the idea of who the conquistadors were. And then there is a SIT task. Remember, SIT stands for us for surprising, interesting, troubling. So you'll see on the worksheet in a moment that I'd like you to write something you found surprising, something you found interesting, and something you found troubling about the conquistadors based on the video that you've just watched. There are then some sources, as you've just seen, to review, and in the first instance, there are some questions about each of the sources. You should answer those questions, which will help you understand each one individually. Now, just be aware that this is going to be on the Microsoft OneNote. Therefore, you might not all have to do all of the sources because there is quite a lot of reading there. Just have a look on your OneNote page. And lastly, the third task for today is to look at the sources again, and this time look for examples of positive or negative impacts that were caused by the Spanish, and complete task 3, which is the table. So if you haven't done so already, on the OneNote, you will find in your class notes page a document that looks like this. There's a bit more to it, but this is what I'd like you to focus on today. The first task, the SIT, S-I-T, surprising, interesting, troubling. The second task is looking at each of the sources and answering the questions in the column on the right hand side. And then thirdly, task 3 is doing as much of the table as you can, finding examples of positive and negative effects of the Spanish conquistadors. There is an example that's done there for you. I'll be available for live chat support during the lesson, and I hope you enjoy learning about the impact of the conquistadors.